May the words of my mouth and the meditation of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer.
Amen.
Amen. Well, we might as well say it right here at the beginning. This is a dreadful story in Genesis. It's a disturbing, awful story at many levels, and it defies one clear interpretation or moral application. It is a story I believe we are meant to sit in, to immerse ourselves in, to become a part of. We are meant to feel the tension and the revulsion of this story, and we're also meant to feel the relief at the resolution. And as I've sat with this story this week, I've experienced all of these things. It's one of those weeks where I can truly say this story has gotten a hold of me and would not let me go. And maybe that's part of the point. As most commentators express that this passage is open to and indeed invites imaginative interpretation, I'm going to take them up on this and offer one to you this morning. But before I offer my thoughts, I would like to remind us of where we left off last week. That the bedrock, the ground upon which the Abraham story and indeed our very lives stand is the faithfulness of God. I believe that at the end of it all, this story and all the stories of Abraham are about God's faithfulness. Any actions on our part need to be seen in comparison to and in light of the faithfulness of God to us. Throughout both Old and New Testaments, God often speaks to people through dreams and visions. This is the case with Abraham on several occasions. I went back and I reread the whole Abraham narrative several times. It begins in chapter 12 and ends a couple chapters after the story we heard this morning. Well, the narrator or narrators of this story, there's more than one stream of tradition that is woven together in what we now have as Genesis. The narrator alternates between God speaking to Abraham in a dream, through angels, and directly talking to him. Sometimes the modes switch in the middle of a passage. Even in this passage we heard from Genesis this morning, it begins by saying that God spoke to Abraham, and ends with God's messenger speaking to Abraham. So I submit for your consideration that this entire episode that we heard this morning of God's testing of Abraham took place in the context of a mystical vision. Now there is some support for this in the text itself. First of all, the name Moriah in Hebrew means seeing. Any connection to a real physical location, while there's speculation, seems to have been lost already by the time that Genesis was written. God invites Abraham to go to the land of seeing, where God will show him something. Further, at the end of the passage, Abraham names the place he has gone. God sees. What did Abraham see in this mystical experience? Abraham saw in a final and decisive way the faithfulness of God against all odds. Now, why did Abraham need to be shown this? Because up to this point, he had only known it in part. Now, to be sure, Abram, as he was known before he was called Abraham, Abram believed God enough to set out from Ur of the Chaldees on his journey with God. God promises to make of him a great nation whose descendants outnumber the stars. When he goes to Egypt to escape to famine, his faith falters and he passes his wife Sarah off as his sister in order to protect his life. When Pharaoh finds out about this, he chastises Abraham for lying, but then turns around and sends him off with loads of loot. God is faithful even when Abraham is not. And as if this wasn't enough, Abraham does it again. He lies to King Abimelech, saying that Sarah is his sister. Now we also find out that Sarah is indeed his half-sister, the daughter of his father and a different mother. But he's omitted the important detail that she's also his wife. Abimelech, again, chastises him, but sends him off with sheep and cattle and more loot. Again, God is faithful even when Abraham isn't. And as we heard last week, Sarah takes matters into her own hands to ensure that there will be offspring from Abraham, and Ishmael is born to Hagar. As a result, God ends up being faithful to both Hagar and Ishmael, in addition to giving Abraham and Sarah a son of promise, Isaac. Yet there seems to be a lingering reservation somewhere in Abraham. So to settle this reservation once and for all, God sets a test before Abraham. In being asked to give up Isaac, he is being asked to give up clinging to the very promise that God has made to him. It's interesting, in Hebrew, the word for offering or sacrifice is offering up. So that's what he's being asked to do with Isaac, to offer him up, to let him go. He's in a very real sense giving the promise back to God, saying to God, as the Hebrew is more accurately translated, God will see to it, which is what the word provides means. God will see to it. Abraham finally abandons himself fully to God, placing his future and the promise of a future for his people squarely in God's hands. And God does see to it. Through this experience, mystical or otherwise, Abraham finally sees that God sees and is faithful beyond measure. And accordingly, he names the place of this experience as such. The place is called God Sees. Now, one objection that can be raised to this interpretation is that I've gutted the story of its dreadfulness and its power by making it a mystical experience instead of a real one. That is, one that Abraham really experienced. I've conveniently also sidestepped the fact that God asked of Abraham something as abhorrent as sacrificing his own son. And I acknowledge that these things are possible. However, I also think that our 20th century minds have a really hard time holding together the seeming paradox that mystical experiences are by definition real, although they are not factual or concrete. Something can be both real and never have happened at the same time. This skeptical view of mystical experiences has not always been the case, though. Both Judaism and Christianity have long traditions of mysticism in them. Augustine, arguably the greatest church father, was converted from a hedonistic pagan lifestyle in a moment to faith in Jesus Christ through a mystical experience. Teresa of Avila, St. John of the Cross, Catherine of Siena, Ignatius of Loyola, all mystics that are cherished and studied to this day for their spiritual wisdom and insight. The best way I know of to demonstrate what I mean by saying that mystical experiences are indeed real and can have the power to transform one's life and faith is through relating a personal story. There's a risk involved in doing this, in that I feel fairly vulnerable in telling it. But I've also learned to trust you and to hope that you will trust me enough at this point in this point that I'm trying to make, and that point will come through. So here's the story. A number of years before I was in the process toward ordination, I was the keynote speaker at a large youth gathering in the Diocese of Western Michigan. My host for the weekend was this 80-year-old woman named Elizabeth, who was about 5 foot tall, snow white hair, wore sneakers, and was a spiritual director and a deeply, deeply spiritual woman. And so, after the conference is over and I'd done my work, we're on our way to the airport. We've got some time to kill, so we stop at this little diner for a bite to eat in the middle of the afternoon. And we walk in and there's no one else in the diner. So we sit down at a booth opposite each other and order our lunch. And right in the middle of a bite, Elizabeth looks up at me and says to me, "Greg, you know you're supposed to be a priest, don't you?" And I said, "No, why should I know that?" She said, "Okay, close your eyes. I want you to go back to our closing Eucharist at the cathedral." And she said to me, "Where are you standing?" And in that moment, I saw in my mind, as clear as I am standing here, that I was standing behind the altar. And I began to cry. And she said, "What are you doing with your arms?" And I had them out. It was as real an experience as anything I have ever experienced. And yet it never happened. That's not where I was standing physically in that room. So when I opened my eyes and I looked at her, she looked me dead in the eye and she goes, "Well, now you know." The purpose of telling this story is not to put the focus on me. It is to illustrate the fact that a person's life can be transformed by an event that never really happened, and yet was truly real. Mystical experiences are those direct experiences of God that are transformational in quality. They are rare. They are initiated by God on God's terms, and most of us don't go looking for them. Something on the other side is known about oneself and God that was not there before. One's life on the other side is never the same. For me, well, here I am. For Abraham, the question of God's unswerving faithfulness to him was settled once for all. If you'll notice in the rest of the narrative until his death, God never speaks to him again. Not because he didn't love Abraham, but there was no need. It was settled. This story serves as the climax of the Abraham saga and as the pivot point for the book of Genesis. What becomes abundantly clear from this story is that God's promise to make a great people from the offspring of Abraham is secure. All of us can breathe a little easier after this story, knowing that no matter how dark the picture may be, no matter how slim the odds, God will come through. The outrageous faithfulness of God is the bedrock upon which all future generations stand. Period. Ours included. Nothing will thwart God's faithfulness, even when all hope seems lost. May our response be the same as Abraham's. God will see to it. Amen.
Amen.